Part three is called Myths and Methods. And the intention is to address some important misconceptions of the theory, especially in order to apply it to research so that research can be rigorous, so that our methods are based on solid theoretical assumptions. So, one possibly misleading belief in CDST is that some people say that CDST says nothing is predictable. Is this true?
Well, Cesar, we make predictions all the time, don't we? I mean, that's part of our survival as human beings, I suppose. But on a much more mundane example, I look outside in the morning or I listen to the weather forecast and I decide to bring my umbrella that day because rain is forecast, is predicted. However, we know that weather forecasts can be unreliable. Edward Lorenz, the famous meteorologist, um, received credit for coining the term butterfly effect in a chaotic system. A minimal difference in beginning stage, the beginning conditions of a system can have massive effects downstream. And of course, the initial conditions are always being updated. It's called the butterfly effect because it's said that a butterfly flapping its wings in one part of the world can have effects on the weather, the whole system, because of feedback loops, because of the sensitivity of the system. It can magnify the effect of the butterfly wings and affect the weather in a distal part of the world. So complex systems in that sense, chaotic complex systems, are unpredictable in the conventional sense. Predictability. System can be described retrospectively. That is, we can observe a path that the dynamic system has already taken. And of course, we have expectations of how a process will unfold, even if its outcome based on our previous experience. As a classroom teacher, when I introduce an activity, if it's not for the first time that I've introduced it, well, even if it's the first time, do I predict the outcome? Maybe. But then the second and third and fourth time I use that activity, I have a certain expectation as how it's going to unfold. But predictability in the strict sense of the term, no. I can have an expectation, I can anticipate a result, but I wouldn't say predictability because essentially the interconnectivity, nonlinearity, and emergence brings about a separation of prediction from explanation. Now, positivistic research, the science, excuse me, physical science research is based on the assumption that there are universal laws and thus sets predictability as a goal of the research process. But from a complexity theory, a CDST perspective, no two situations are similar enough to produce the same behavior. Therefore, a prediction is not dependable. In addition, there are multiple pathways by which the system can evolve.
Mm.
And the same cause, excuse me, can in specific circumstances produce different effects. Prediction, of course, is related to causality. We all want to know about causality. But David Byrne, the sociologist, wrote this, and I got this from Seeley and Carter's book, which is wonderful. He wrote about accounting for tuberculosis. So how do we account? What is the cause of tuberculosis? Well, you might start with a biological etiology at first, of course, and say tuberculosis is caused by a bacillus. And you could add that people must be exposed to the bacillus, right? That certainly has to happen. Another quantifier, and you mentioned this before, there may be a genetic component. You might want to say, well, some people have a natural resistance to the bacillus. But that's not enough either, because whether or not the individuals will contract the disease will be socially contingent, since it will depend on their interaction between the features and other levels of the social world. And it's not enough to say social world, because what is the character of the social world? Do people live in squalor where they don't get proper food and nutrition and water? Then they may be more vulnerable, more susceptible to the disease, right? So the social world itself is complex. Then too, A drug that works for one patient does not work for another because of the complex systems represented by the patients, and they differ in some important respects. So prediction is difficult, if not impossible. I just saw yesterday in some research that was done at the University of Pennsylvania that, or it was reported in Penn, I don't know if the researchers were at Penn, that, no, sorry, it was a different source, but anyway, that how we breathe is individual. You have a breathing signature because we all inhale and exhale, but the rate at which we do, how much oxygen we take in or air we take in, how much our brain connects to that whole process, that they could actually tell individual breathing signatures. Amazing. You know, maybe we won't need fingerprints anymore. We can just breathe into some machine, will identify you. Anyway, the point is, we know that medicines don't work for everyone, right? And sometimes there are untoward effects, side effects that are not beneficial. So the point is that prediction is absolute prediction. No expectation. Of course, you don't undertake research on pharmaceutical drugs if you don't have an expectation that something will work. You don't do an activity in a classroom unless you have an expectation that it'll be productive. But absolute predictability, I don't think so. No, too many, the situations are too varied.
Yes, even people in medical research, they struggle with that. To come up with guidelines, for example, in the US, I've seen some interviews with the people who do that, and they what they do is that they accumulate all kinds of evidence, and they always make an effort to have multiple sources of evidence. It's not just the clinical trials.
That's right.
They have all kinds of sources of evidence, and that's how they make their decisions. It's not just the trials, the probabilities, and the prediction. It's quite amazing. So there's an ethical component even.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And
a
lot of times we get dietary advice, don't eat peanuts if you have an allergy, or don't eat, for a while they were saying don't eat eggs because of the high level of cholesterol. But it's not treating the whole organism as a system, right? It's just treating one part, and therefore they fail because we find out later that in fact eating peanuts just a little. Now saying if somebody has a tendency to have and peanut allergies can be very serious, right? But the way to avoid that is to give the infant or young child a little bit, just peanuts, a little bit peanut butter. And over a course of the time, they'll produce a tolerance, and the allergic reaction won't be so severe. Anyway, these things change because the body is a system, and treating one part and giving one directive while ignoring the other parts means that the directive won't work for everybody. And in fact, it can have deleterious effects for some.
A second possibly misleading belief is that CDST cannot satisfy its methodological need to take into account as many variables as possible.
Yeah, in the past, I called this the quote-unquote boundary problem. Where do you draw the boundary around the system of interest? The sergeant, who was quoted in Baird, Baker, and Kitazawa's article in 2014, wrote, "To become an object of scientific investigation, it's necessary that the object be delimited and have boundaries imposed upon it. But with such regulation comes the danger of partialism, of ignoring the holistic picture, albeit out of practical necessity, in favor of something more manageable." And I would go a little further and say there's not only a danger to partialism, I think you're going to get a spurious, false view if you draw the boundary in a way that limits it to certain factors and ignores others, because all of it is a complex system contributing to it. The late philosopher and complexivist, whom I had the privilege of meeting at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, Paul Sliers, made the dilemma clear. And I'm quoting now, because everything is always interacting and interfacing with others, and the environment organically, the notion of inside a system and outside a system are never simple or uncontested. Of course, it's humanly impossible to study everything at once. As Cilliers later observed, 2005, boundaries are still required if we want to talk about complex systems in a meaningful way, that they are in fact necessary. But care must be taken concerning what to leave out and what to leave in and what to omit, because that has political consequences. Who or what are you going to omit? In my previous discussion of the boundary problem in 2011, I fretted about where to draw the line due to strategic considerations at stake. This is not about reductionism, as I explained earlier. It's about creating a more manageable research agenda, but not about ontological reductionism. I appealed at the time to Bateson's advice for how to delineate the system, or Atkinson, Churchill, Yoshino, and Okada's advice. The one I liked especially, well, at least it seemed to be more practical to implement, was Richard Lewontin, the biologist, who wrote, "Before we can recognize meaningful parts, we must define the functional whole of which they are constituents." So a functional explanation, by the way, he's a biologist, right? So his example was the hand is the appropriate unit of analysis, or a unit of investigation, I should say. If we're interested in holding, what does holding consist of? Then you focus on the hand. But if you're interested in grasping, then you need to focus on the hand-eye coordination. It takes two of them, hand and eye, to reach and grasp something. They are the irreducible unit for understanding something. So it's a functional explanation, makes sense to me. Now, how to implement that is a challenge, but I like that explanation. Since then, others have offered other methodological innovations. Steenbeek and Van Keert's simplex system as a praxis-based form of representing complexity without overtly breaking it into pieces or breaking it away from the study of the larger system within which it's embedded. Gary Fogel recommends system mapping, visually showing the interconnected feedback loops, beginning with a particular point of entry and following it in the complex system, and continuing to watch as it evolves, as it modifies itself, initially through use by agents, then to revisiting the question of where the boundary lies for the system of interest, and being aware of the methodological rich points. Seems to me a lot like what good ethnographers wrestle with. And ethnography certainly is a method that is compatible with CDST. The point is that we don't draw boundaries once and for all. We need to continually revisit them with something like design-based research, where one defines a system to investigate, then continually revises it as an updated understanding dictates, much as Reagan deals with in his discussion of casing, using case-based methods. So it's not that you define the system once and for all. As the system evolves, you start to see it take shape. And there's a whole discussion about whether or not it's the languaging that gives it shape, but I can't go there right now. The point is, it's not a once and for all discussion, a decision.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would say many researchers, maybe when faced with the prospect of complex causality, fear the implication is humans don't have any control over events or any free will. While that may seem like a logical conclusion at first glance, this is indeed not at all an implication of the theory. Instead, CDST sees us, teachers, students, humans in general, as agents. So what are agents?
Thanks for the question. I'm going to quote Heidi Byrne here, where she writes, "Human agency informed by meaning is absolutely part of the causal nexus." That's Byrne, 2013. These are shaped, the causal nexus are shaped by their past histories and relationships within and across context, as well as the social structures and institution within which they live and work. CDST deliberately, this is me now, deliberately centers the individual learner as the agent who navigates their own unique developmental paths as they make meaningful patterns through soft assembly. Soft assembly just contrast with hard rules, or no, not hard rules. Soft assembly to contrast with innatism. Soft assembly meaning the learner cobbles together what he or she knows of the language at the time to deal with the exigencies, the communicative pressures at hand. So anyway, going back a little bit, sorry. The learners make meaningful patterns through soft assembly and adapt the patterns to meet their specific present goals. That's an agentive move. So an agent is an organism that has the power to act intentionally. I mentioned that just a while ago, which is different, by the way, from the way that agent-based models are often used in restricted complexity. We're not talking about agent-based models, we're about agents, that is, those that have intention. In my paper in 2019 on agency and CDST, I adopted Evan Thompson's definition, which I rather like. Agency is the capacity to act in the world. When we put learners into categories, we say they are motivated or not. We fail to honor their agency as individuals. CDST, like Yoshida says, treats learners as real persons rather than as theoretical abstractions. It also rejects a view of a language learner as passive. From a CDST perspective, it's better to think of learners perceiving and acting on affordances, this is Van Leer, on affordances or opportunities to learn rather than their processing input made comprehensible for them by others. It's also important to recognize that agency is not innate or inherent. Agency can only be captured in its full complexity, Gallia writes, if it's situated within the flow of time and takes into account structural and relational aspects toward which participants can achieve different orientations. Because they can assume different orientations, agents are able to reframe their relationship to the context. You know, maybe they don't like the textbook, for instance, but if the goal is to pass the course, they can reframe their orientation. They have an agency to be able to reframe their attitude if the goal is important to them. Learners are agentive in another sense. From a CDST perspective, learners do not need to depend on others for negative feedback. They can generate their own through anticipation. This is Goldberg and her students' work. Statistical preemption, explaining one thing and finding another. You expect something, expecting one thing, and then you find something else. You're going to provide yourself with the negative feedback to revise your understanding. Provided that the learner's system remains open, a learner's language resources can grow in the learner's quest for increased functionality. I mentioned this earlier, but let me make the point here that a quest that motivates change towards increased functionality is also the same quest, the same impetus for biological systems to evolve, according to linguist Tommy Gavan. Going beyond Roger Anderson's one-to-one principle. So you learn one greeting, the meaning of one greeting, but with increased functionality, you start to learn other greetings and you become more discerning about when you use which. And that increasing functionality moves beyond the one-to-one principle that early second language development seems to be characterized by. Of course, the context in which teaching and learning takes place is all important. And I acknowledge, as Claire Crumsh expresses it, that we are free to act. At the same time, we are not in control of the choices that are given to us.
A fourth belief that some people may hold is that CDST has nothing to say about L2 pedagogy. So I don't know how people come to this, but I've encountered it many times, so I mention it. But I've seen your talks online. You always mention the classroom context. In one of your events, you even gave teachers teaching resource there. And there is an entire chapter in your 2008 book about complexity theory, just about the teaching. So, but nevertheless, I think we should address it, even though it's false.
Yeah, I mean, actually has a great deal to say. I'm not only chapters and books, I've written books on this. So, yeah, I mean, my teaching language from grammar to grammaring certainly has that flavor. Perhaps our flavor is kind of not doing justice to it. It has its central motive. Perhaps the most central tenet is the adoption of in a pedagogical approach using CDST, implementing CDST. Perhaps the most central tenet is the adoption of a learning-centered approach, framing pedagogy in service of individuals' processes of development. While both teacher-centered and learner-centered approaches have their place in pedagogy, I think a learning-centered approach is more consistent with CDST. In a learning-centered approach, for example, and again, a lot more that could be said about this, but teachers teach in response to where students are, not just, and what they have learned, in other words, and what they're interested in learning. Not just because it's the next chapter in the textbook and the next item on a syllabus or curriculum. With a learning-centered approach, learners are seen as active participants in the language learning environment. Language learning is not an isolated activity with the implicit causality of input and output. It is also not climbing a developmental ladder. Instead, learners with shared exposure create their own developmental paths and develop to some extent divergently, as Hahn 2019 put it. However, teaching, of course, is a normative act. So even if learners diverge, ideally students' consciousness is recruited. And with older learners, their attention is directed through explicit instruction, which needs to be complemented by opportunities for these learners to use their language resources in psychologically authentic, I've written about that, and iterative, not repetitive, but iterative activities, and adhering to what I call an organic syllabus. And there's a lot in that, but I said the whole book is about this, right?
Yes.
So I think I'll leave it at that. However, I will say that CDST problematizes the deep-seated assumption, following Davidson Simp, that learning is a matter of assembling an internal model of an external reality. It's not. It's just as teaching does not cause learning, it's not that one learns a language and then uses it. There's only one step to the process. As Gleick wrote, the act of playing the game as a way of changing the rules. So yes, I talk about language use because it is in using the language that it gets learned. In other words, the act of using language meaningfully in social encounters or interactions will change the learner's system and the skill which they deploy it. Approaching pedagogy is a process of establishing enabling conditions. I got that term from my daughter-in-law, enabling conditions, for learners to accomplish their own learning. And that's a departure from more conventional positions.